Your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse.
That is not true.
The first big city to fall was Kunduz. One after another, Afghanistan's biggest cities outside of Kabul were captured. Herat to the west.
Terrorists in Kabul carrying out the deadliest attack on U.S. troops in over a decade.
Afghanistan is lost.
Freedom came under attack. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes.
At my direction, a small team of Americans carried out the operation with extraordinary courage. They killed Osama bin Laden.
Al-Baghdadi is dead.
It's time to end America's longest war. We'll do it responsibly.
Rushing to the airport, behind them, the sound of gunfire.
Deliberately.
Countless Afghans who helped American troops were left behind.
And safely.
Afghans by the thousands desperate to escape life under the Taliban.
Today I'm sitting down to talk to my dad, Jay Sekulow, Chief Counsel of the American Center for Law and Justice and the European Center for Law and Justice. My father is an accomplished and internationally respected judicial advocate and has presented oral arguments before the Supreme Court of the United States numerous times. He defends the Constitution, constitutional freedoms, and especially those involving religious liberty. He's also addressed the United Nations in defense of the State of Israel. The National Law Journal named him one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America. He is also the New York Times best-selling author of multiple books, including The Rise of ISIS, and has been honored for his work defending human rights and religious liberty around the world. We are joined today by Chief Counsel of the American Center for Law and Justice and my dad, Jay Sekulow, who is been involved in this ongoing, even from the beginning days of the War on Terror, that you were there. I think that's something people don't necessarily know because, I mean, they don't have the 20-year overview. Right. But really, your work started pretty early in this.
Well, very early, right after the attack, actually, I received a call by the Attorney General of the United States, John Ashcroft. He asked if I would assist in the drafting, especially on the constitutional issues of what was called the Patriot Act, which allowed governmental agencies to share information regarding terrorism with other governmental agencies inside the United States. It had been pretty much siloed before then. If the CIA knew something, they weren't sharing it necessarily with the Defense Department. If the FBI had something, it wouldn't necessarily go to the CIA. So General Ashcroft asked a group of lawyers, it was me, Ken Starr, Viet Din, Paul Clement, others, to look at improving the law so that our capabilities could shift, because we had to go from a law enforcement capability, which is what the Department of Justice primarily did, to a counterterrorism approach. And General Ashcroft was instrumental in that, and I was fortunate enough in horrible circumstances to be able to work with him on the Patriot Act.
Yeah, the Patriot Act has been something that's been brought up many times throughout the years, for good and bad. People have expressed. Now, there are administrations who maybe have used the Patriot Act to overreach, it seems like, at times, to not use what it originally intended was for.
You know, originally we had sunset provisions in the act because I don't think anybody anticipated that 20 years after that act would pass, that we'd still be engaged in this kind of war on terror that we are. So there's been some abuses, there's no doubt about it. I think the overall approach to the law was right. It was right for the country at the time, and it was something that we needed to do. And I think it prevented other future attacks. But you got to put yourself back into those days right after September 11th. When I was in Washington, I'm still seeing, from our apartment, you don't remember this, but from the apartment on Pennsylvania Avenue that we had, you looked at the Pentagon and you saw the smoke for days.
Yeah, so it was a different time. It was even a different time for America. We brought up this with a lot of our guests, which is it felt like a very unifying moment. And again, for those who have watched this series, they know that I've asked this question before, but it's 9 months into a presidency was the September 11th attack. Yeah. Under the Bush administration, we saw a big uniting of the country, all of us aggressively against what was going on in Afghanistan, and inevitably things happened in Iraq. There was more division there. Right. Now we're 9 months into a presidency, almost 10 months or 9 months into a presidency. So roughly the same amount of time has passed from when George W. Bush took office to September 11th to when President Biden took office to the what ended up being the very failed pull out of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And you kind of see people not uniting in that way. Maybe uniting, there maybe is finally some agreement that, but not towards a political party. It's an agreement that this was just an egregious disaster.
No, it wasn't. Look, a lot of the Republicans and Democrats wanted to get out of Afghanistan. We'd been there 20 years. Then there was others, and it looks like now that we've learned from the military after their testimony in the last several days, we've learned that the military wanted to keep that force of 2,500 in place because they felt that was sufficient to keep the Afghanistan army engaged. It was the fall of the Afghan army that really created the problem, but it was the fall of the United States intelligence community that didn't anticipate what was going to happen here. And there's been very serious geopolitical consequences of this. You know, I'm trying to look at it historically. We were there for 20 years. Fighting them over there was better than fighting them over here. And their intent was to bring it to us. They did bring it to us 20 years ago. They brought it to the United States. We had to deal with it in the United States. I'll never forget, I mean, this is part of the 9/11 experience, the horrible aspects of it. We then had the Anthrax attack. You remember that? Your brother and I were in Washington. I was in the Supreme Court building, the Department of Justice, and the White House, all three of which had anthrax. The whole mindset was different. You went in Washington, D.C., you saw on the streets. I went to dinner with Stuart Roth from our office and Jordan, who was in school then. And we went to Blackie's Steakhouse, a famous steakhouse in Washington, D.C. And on the corners of the streets were tanks.
Right.
I mean, it was a different time.
Yeah, I think people lose perspective over time.
Yeah.
You know, we were at a very rough year, year and a half, 2 years. But because of these events, then you'll seemingly have relative peace for 20 years. And it seems to have happened cyclically. If you look at history, that a whole generation will grow up, there will be nothing really they've lived through, and then something like this will happen. September 11th, this happened. Obviously, there was things like the Great Recession that happened in 2008. There were a lot of things for this generation to deal with.
You've had a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, a tremendous. I mean, think about that. You were born and teenagers in 9/11. Then 8 years later, we have the greatest recession since the Depression in the United States, the greatest economic setback in U.S. history since the Depression. Now, you're adults and you have kids and you've got a pandemic that has swept the entire world. So yeah, you've been through a lot. And then we had, of course, Afghanistan during that entire time was still going on.
Yeah, and people bring up, this is just the media side of me, people bring this up a lot in conversations, which is now you're seeing really a rise in television and movies, really the last decade. I've seen in reboots and new movies that were based on old things or cartoons that have come back for kids that were kids now. It's because our generation looks at September 11th as sort of a benchmark, and anything before that is nostalgic and good and positive. So if we can bring things back, this year is Ghostbusters and Top Gun, because it takes you to a time where pre-terrorism really in a lot of people's heads for my generation. But that's beside the point. When it comes to what happened now, though, we fast forward 20 years. In between the time you've written books, The Rise of ISIS, you've written The Unholy Alliance, it seems like those topics the last 4 years were relatively quiet. Were relatively not even that important on the grand scale, or 4 to 6 years. Now, it seems like all of them are on the forefront once again. Even Jerusalem. All three of your books that came out a decade ago till more recently, are all more prevalent now, just in this past summer, than what's happened.
Well, because when we wrote the book on ISIS was barely even known. It was a thesis paper I wrote at the University of Oxford that turned into a book because all of a sudden ISIS started doing attacks on Americans, including beheadings. So The Rise of ISIS became a serious threat. Then we went to the second book, which was also done at the University of Oxford, was, as you say, the Unholy Alliance. It's the whole Iran, Syria, and Russia. And the interesting aspect of that was the concern about Russia's dominance in all of this, and the Russian government's dominance in all of this. They were really calling the shots for these governments. So one of the horrifying things to me that came out of the pullout was not just that we lost 13 Americans, which was horrific, and that the pullout was a disaster, which was unbelievable. And whether you could debate whether we should have left troops there or not, that's a separate debate. I think in hindsight, probably keeping the 2,500 counter-terrorism troops there probably would have been a good idea. I was one of the ones in favor of getting out. I think in hindsight, I don't think that necessarily was the right decision. Putting all that aside, the fact that the President of the United States, Joe Biden, met with Vladimir Putin, well, world leaders meet all the time, and discussed the possibility of the United States of America our military, Army, Air Force, Marines, utilizing Russian Army bases, military bases, so that we could deploy from Russian military bases in our counterterrorism work in Afghanistan, because we've left Americans behind and we surrendered Bagram Air Base, which was a huge give up. So you look at yourself and you're saying, I think Russia's been a threat. I think most experts on foreign policy would agree. Just think about the thought of the United States having military personnel, equipment, armaments, munitions, weapons, based on Russian military bases with Russian military personnel and U.S. military personnel. Now, let me tell you, that is a recipe for disaster. But instead of dismissing it, this president has General Milley, the chief of staff for the armed forces, call his Russian counterpart to discuss the possibility. Now, if the previous administration would have done that, there'd be calls for impeachment. Now, I don't think this is a basis of a call for impeachment, because I don't think you can impeach over lousy policies. But that was a lousy policy decision.
But that is more for your own standard saying that, because I think now they've moved the goalpost of what an impeachable offense is, because the last 4 years we've obviously seen a much less claim become the standard for impeachment. So yes, while you're glad you're sticking to your standard and you're glad you're actually sticking up for what you believe and what the Constitution says, it's not going both ways.
No, politically it's certainly not, because the president, previous president, the 45th president of the United States, Donald Trump, was impeached over a phone call to the president of Ukraine. Again, you may not like the call, you may not like the policy, but that's not a high crime or misdemeanor. But it became a whole base. I mean, I defended the impeachment in the Senate successfully, but it became a whole basis for it.
Well, if you have moral character, I think that's okay. But then you have the other option, which is, like you said, the dealings with Russia, and then what's been known, and we've now known for about the last month, like the hit list that essentially came out that was, now when you're talking about the fact that we're giving these things to the Taliban, which even our own government is still classifying as a terrorist organization.
Well, they're a terrorist organization. They spawned al-Qaeda. They work with al-Qaeda. They are al-Qaeda. It's the same goals, different name. But that's another issue. Think about that one for a moment. We surrendered control of the air base, which was the Kabul airport, which is the commercial airport, their civilian airport. We surrendered that to the Taliban. We could have kept control of that. We had 6,000 troops. We could have kept control. We didn't. We gave it to the Taliban. And then for Americans to get out, or Afghans that worked with Americans to get out, they had to be on a list. So we gave the list of our allies, our interpreters, to the Taliban. Now, I want people to think about this for a moment. What military officer thought that was a good idea? But then you had the Biden administration actually saying, well, we have a business-like relationship with the terrorists.
Right, and that's become the constant in this series, which is for a lot of us who lived through this, who are involved early on in the war on terror, when you start hearing the Taliban used in just the normal lexicon of our government, it is very hard to swallow. It's hard. It sure is. It's hard to deal with.
They killed Americans. They will kill Americans. They will continue. They did kill Americans, of course, allowed Americans to be killed if they were not involved in it directly themselves. And that didn't happen by accident when 13 Americans were imploded by a bomb, a suicide bomber. That's al-Qaeda. That's the Taliban. That's what they do. And, so in a sense, we've allowed history to repeat itself within a 2-decade period. And this administration is operating with blinders on. And, the fact that we left Americans behind is outrageous. The fact that President Biden said the military told him, there was not one person in the senior officers of the military that told him we should leave troops on the ground. And then General Milley came out and said that was their recommendation, to leave troops on the ground. And Joe Biden can't remember if he had that conversation. Now, I'm not questioning his memory, I'm questioning his truthfulness. Joe Biden knows what he was told. Listen, he made a decision. We're getting out, period. I don't care what the generals say. You know what? He's the president of the United States. He gets to make that decision. But don't lie about it. And the duplicity, and what you were saying, Logan, the double standard. If Donald Trump had the Secretary of Defense and the Chief of Staff meeting with the Russian military about Afghanistan, you know what would be happening, right?
Right.
Well, could you imagine also if Donald Trump would have said, all the military generals told me to get out, when all of them told him not to get out? But that's not the way it plays in the media. Although he has gotten hit pretty hard, but not where it matters. Well, and when I say where it matters is the American people better wake up. Here's what it is, the rise of ISIS.
That was one of my next points, which is not unlike they kind of are spinning this. And we heard people, when we were recording this in the hearings yesterday, you refer to the current Taliban as Taliban 2.0. That keeps coming to. And then with ISIS, we know ISIS had some responsibility in the attack that ended up killing many of our troops and hundreds of ISIS-K. But now it's ISIS-K. It's, before it was the Taliban 2.0, and now it's ISIS-K. It feels like we're throwing in different phrases, different terms to almost try to make us feel better. That we originally took out ISIS, we originally had the Taliban at bay, but now that we've allowed these to resurrect, we're now calling them a different name. And these are not names, I mean, the Taliban is, but ISIS is not like they're running around even saying ISIS.
They never said, we
said ISIS.
We gave them the label ISIS, Iraq, Syria, Levant, Israel. Right. That's what we defined them by the territory they wanted to get, they wanted to obtain. But here's what they all are, radical Islamic terrorists. And let me tell you what they have in common, the destruction of Western democracy and any aspect of Western democracy that might be existing in their own country, like women being able to drive or go to school.
Do you think that's why we have many of our allies, whether it's the UK or France, they've all had these issues with America right now? Because not only do they see the pullout being a disaster, but also that we're normalizing relations with these, again, like you said, terrorist regimes.
Well, look, I mean, I think there's not only are we normalizing it, when generals start using business-like approach and they're talking about the Taliban, I think it tells you what we're dealing with. But look, words, you're in the media business, words matter. And they are telling the story, the messaging, if you will, the way they want it out there. Now, I'm glad you're doing this series because this is going to give us a real historical perspective from the people that actually live the history.
And right now, while it's happening, I think that's the one thing we have to reiterate multiple times we're doing this, is when we're recording these interviews, this is in real time as you can be. We've done this over the course of the last month, and it has been since we think the first interview we did was the day or two after the fall of Afghanistan in general. And now we are a month later discussing still what comes up, and it seems like new things keep coming up. We kind of thought we'd do this series for 2 weeks, we'd record a few things, we'd release it, but every week seems to be like another piece of this puzzle. Like I said, this in the last couple of days was the situation with Russia. And
we also don't know how many people are left behind. I mean, Senator Kane's, did he ever get an answer to his question?
I don't know if
I don't think he did. No. There were reports of 100, then it was 200, then somebody said it could be as many as 4,000. So the United States doesn't know how many Americans are in Afghanistan. That's another comforting thought. Yeah. This is no disrespect to the military. It's no disrespect to anyone. But let me tell you something. When Admiral Kirby gets up there at the Pentagon and gives his press statements, these are not confidence-building measures. When I see these generals testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee, these aren't confidence builders. This is chaotic.
Yep. And the one thing we haven't really brought up is this past summer, Israel obviously was dealing with a lot. We saw kind of attacks back, a big fight even a political fight that happened in Israel. How does Israel play into this situation in Afghanistan? But it's more just U.S. policy that could really impact the future of that country if they can see, and I think that's what's scary for the UK and some of these countries, they see the way that these situations are treated now from the current administration, that there is concern worldwide.
If you're in Israel where you're in a hostile neighborhood, and you've had 4 years in Israel where you've had peace agreements with countries you never thought you were going to have peace agreements with, and economic agreements, and trade and tourism agreements with the UAE, with the Gulf region, with, Saudi Arabia, very close relationship now with Israel. You never thought that would be possible. Happened under President Trump. Now you've got another administration in there that almost wants to walk away from the Abraham Accords. It's not something they're trying to build on. And so sure, if you're an Israeli politician, if you're an Israeli citizen, I think you have to be concerned about this.
For someone who lived through many different things in the last 60 years or so, a lot of people tie this back to Vietnam. They look at Vietnam and say, well, this was a similar situation in the sense of it was going to be inevitable. Then when we left, we were going to leave in disaster. Look what happened in Vietnam. Yeah. But this was a much different situation. And I think even, some of the visual cues are similar. You see the Black Hawk helicopters leaving.
Right.
But I don't think this is the same because, one, we have a different world. But there are people in the streets that we see all this imagery of Vietnam. We know that there was an outcry then as well. So how do you feel like those two connect? We haven't talked about that much.
Well, look, I was the last lottery for the draft for the Vietnam War. I was the very last one they had. And I was number 7. I didn't get called up because the war was ending. And it ended, it was horrible. The imaging was horrible. It was a war we could not continue to fight. It was really a fight against the United States and Russia, and the Vietnamese, North and South, were basically the proxies, except the United States entered the war with real troops, and the Russians never really had boots on the ground.
So not a dissimilar situation in some ways.
Yeah, it's not that dissimilar. Look, I think we tied up the Islamic terrorists in Afghanistan so they didn't do anything in the United States. There were attacks in the United States during this last 20 years, but not at the scale that we had seen in 9/11. But the ending, Joe Biden said this, it's not going to be Hanoi, a helicopter over Hanoi, and it was exactly that.
Right.
It was the Black Hawk helicopter with some guy either hanging from it or something. And we left all that equipment there too, which is another disaster in all this.
Yeah, you think you'd learn from the mistakes of the past, but it seems like that
he just wanted out. And It didn't matter evidently what the generals thought. It didn't matter what his advisors thought. He wanted out, he got out. But he got out in a very dangerous way, and it's put the whole region at risk.
One thing we usually like to wrap up on is it was 20 years of relative peace in that region. Yes, there was, obviously, like I said, there were attacks that happened.
Right.
But for the most part, there was 20 years there of success, which is nothing to not remember. It's easy to forget and easy to focus on what's happened in the last month. Yeah. But a lot of people served, a lot of people suffered, a lot of people died for this war.
Yeah.
I was at the Iwo Jima monument, and they're putting in where the war ends. And right now it's 2001 until dash. And my son was talking about it. I go, oh well, now we'll have a 2021 coming up, and this was a month and a half ago. This was early August, and we said, oh well, that's it seemed like a positive. Now it seems like it's going to be a moment we easily think of as a negative, but there was 20 years of good there, and a lot of people who died for the right reasons.
They served and kept us safe for 20 years. These men and women of ours and our allies did not die in vain. They kept the fight in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, rather than it being in Manhattan, where it was, in Washington, D.C., and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The terrorists took the battle to the United States, and in their first round, brought harm to the United States. They had sporadic attacks since then, but nothing on the scale that they pulled off in 2001. And we can thank the men and women of our military for that.
Absolutely. All right, well, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.